Hey, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and today we're making a stonewashed skinning knife and a leather sheath. Check it out. Now to start off with this project, I had a client come in asking for a birthday present for their father, and they had seen the skinning knife and wanted something like that. So they asked me if I could just make it a little bit bigger. So I keep templates of all the knives I've made, even the ones that are a few years old, and this one I just sort of extrapolated on that template and made it a little bit bigger so that it would fit better in the guy's hands. So I traced the template onto some Mylar, stretched it out a little bit, and I cut the Mylar template out so that I can continue to use it if I ever want to make one again. So what's nice about the Mylar is that it's translucent, and I stick it onto the steel with a magnet, I trace it with a Sharpie, and then I use a punch to center punch all the holes that I'm going to be drilling later on. And the Mylar will last for a really long time, so it's good to have. I'm going to drill my finger hole with a annular cutter on the drill press, and that's a carbide tipped hole saw that's made specifically for cutting metal. And these are really great, they last a long time, they're well worth the money. And now that that's cut out and drilled out, I'll cut the profile on the bandsaw, and I'm never too crazy to get close to the line when I'm profiling a blade like this. I want to get a rough shape, and then I'll go over to the sander and I'll refine the shape and get really close to the line to make sure that it's what I'm looking for. And I'm adding a little oil on the tracks that I'm cutting just to sort of lubricate the cut. The blade was sort of dull, so I was kind of fighting, but I got through it. And now I'll take that annular cutter again and I'll drill out the upper finger hole in the grip. That'll get me a nice, perfect half circle, and I relieve that cut back on the portaband. And the push block on the portaband is very helpful to kind of keep your fingers safe and to just sort of make it a little easier to get some extra mass behind the piece of metal so you get an easier cut. Now I'll go over to my 2x72 belt grinder and I'll just refine the profile a little bit. I'm not really going too crazy. I'm going to wind up having to heat treat and surface grind this blade, so I'm going to be profiling it a few times, but right now I'm just trying to get the general shape down. Back onto the drill press, I'll drill the holes for the pins that are going to hold the scales on. And I'm piloting the holes with about a 3/16 inch drill bit, and then I'll jump up to a 3/8 inch drill bit to get the holes for the hollow stainless steel pins. And I just deburr everything on my countersinking drill press. I head over to my surface grinder and I just flatten everything out. The CPM 154 that I'm using on this did not come surface ground, so it had some pretty bad forging marks in it. And the surface grinder just helps get everything nice and even and make sure the blade's going to be nice and flat. And then once I'm off the surface grinder, I like to dress the flats on my blades before I grind the bevel. So I'm just giving everything a nice consistent flat grind line and getting out any marks that might have been there, making sure that everything looks nice and smooth before I grind in my bevels. I'm also laying out the jimping that's going to be on top. So I use a caliper, and then I use this little carbide burr to just get in some jimping just for a little extra grip. And now using red Dychem layout fluid, I lay out the center line of the bevel, and I lay out the actual heights of the bevels as well with a caliper. So I've gone over this in some other videos, but basically just trying to find the center and trying to lay out my grind so that everything winds up nice and even. And I'm using a little plunge line guide block that I made. It's basically just two pieces of steel clamped to the side of the blade, and that just keeps my plunge lines equal on both sides. And I'm grinding in this bevel with an 80 grit zirconium belt, and the blade steel is pretty thin, so the bevel grinds in relatively quickly. And I'm not going super high with the bevel. I'm keeping it around maybe 3/4 of an inch to an inch from the edge, and that'll be nice for this type of knife. If you're interested in bevel grinding and knife making grinding videos, Walter Sorrells has a great channel where he does a lot of really in-depth knife making videos, and he's a very experienced professional knife maker with a lot of great information. I'll put a link to his channel in the description of this. You can see the bevels roughed in over there. So now I'm just going to trace out my handle scales, and this is some ebony that the client picked out. We're going for sort of like a blacked out stealth knife, and I cut it out with the bandsaw and just get it sort of close to the general shape. And then I head back over to the scales, and I clamp the scales onto the blank, and I use the holes that I already drilled in the blade to transfer through the handle with a drill bit, so that when I go to put everything on, I know everything's going to line up. And it's important to not fully profile the scales yet, because if something were to shift, I'd want to be able to grind away that material to make sure that they were perfect when I was totally done. So now I can do a little more profiling on those scales if I want to. I'm going to be adding the client's initials to this knife, the person who the gift's going to, and then I'll add my maker's mark on the other side, which is just the letter Z that I stamp in with a heavy-duty punch. So I like to do as much as I can during the off time of knife making, so I'm going to design my sheath for this knife before I put the knife in the heat treating oven. So the way I design my sheaths is I always do them on paper, and took a little while for me to figure out how to do this correctly, but I basically just extrapolate around the blade by 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch, and then I act as though the paper is leather, and I just sort of make a pouch that I think will work. And it kind of comes with experience that you learn sort of what parts to extend and where to leave extra material, but I get pretty close in the paper, and then I feel confident that I can put the knife in the heat treating oven, and I can cut out the leather, and I won't have any problems going forward. And now with that done, I can go over and put the knife in some high temperature heat treating foil, and I can heat treat the knife. And the heat treating process is about 1 hour and 20 minutes for the heat treating, and then two 2-hour sessions for the tempering. So you're looking at a little over 5 hours. So I have about 5 hours of time that I can be doing something else. And that time is important because the leather sheaths can take a while to do. So I want to use the time as wisely as I can. So I'm just making sure to seal up this foil packet really tight, make sure it's nice and airtight. And I'm using the arbor press and a little ball peen hammer, and then I put it in the heat treat oven and get to work on the leather sheath. And this is some 5-ounce veg tan leather that I had actually gotten on Amazon. It's a little more expensive than buying it from someone like Tandy Leather, where you're buying a hide, but it's a manageable size and I can get it in 2 days. So I've been buying it from them kind of often. And I'm just using a regular razor blade to cut out the leather sheath. And I like to leave a little bit of room around my pencil line. I want the sheath to just maybe be a little bit oversized, then I'll cut it down if I have to. And the first thing I'm going to be working on is the belt loop. So I kind of get the belt loop to the right shape, I put a little bit of leather glue on it and clamp it up and let it sit so that it firms up. Once I remove the clamps, it's still glued on there, I add a hole for a rivet, and then I stamp in some thread holes with the prong punches, the leather working punches. And everything that I do involving leather is hand stitched. So you have to punch the holes with the prong punch, and then you have to thread through your thread. So I'm using a wax thread, it's a leather working thread, and some heavy duty needles. And the reason that I add that rivet spot is because I want somewhere for the thread to end where I can tie a nice knot and put a rivet in there, and it'll lock in the knot and really keep it strong, and I won't have to worry about the knot coming loose or the thread coming off. I've made a lot of sheets this way, and none of them have fallen apart. So now the belt loop's in there, I glue up the rest of the sheet, the sort of major thread area, that'll keep it together. Now at this point, the knife comes out of the oven and gets quenched, and CPM 154 is quenched between aluminum blocks with compressed air. I pull the knife out of the packet, and you can see the color it is when it comes out, and I check it for hardness with a file. And at this point the knife is very hard, but it's also very brittle, so I want to be careful not to drop it because it could crack. And I utilize this downtime to make sure that the sheath is correctly sized and everything looks good, so I can move forward and cut some more holes and do some more threading. Now while this is going, I have the knife back in the heat treating oven for the tempering process. So while I'm working on this, in the background the knife is doing one of its two-hour tempering sessions. And right there I just was burnishing the end of the leather with a hardwood white oak wheel that I made for the buffer. And that just helps seal up the grain of the leather on the edges so they don't fray. Now I'm adding the snap and preparing myself to do the threading on the large ends, just doing a little bit of beveling to make sure the sheath is nice and cleaned up. And again, I'm using the prong punch to get everything cut so that I can just push the threads right through it. It's important to make sure your prong punch is going deep enough, otherwise you can have a real hard time pushing your needles through to thread these things. I set myself up with my little multi-position vise, and this thing is really good for doing leather work because of the way it twists, and you have these rubber pads on the jaws. It keeps you from marking up your leather, and now it's just a matter of threading through. And I'm very conscious to make sure that I keep the stitch nice and tight. I want to make sure that I don't have any problems with it coming loose and maybe buckling. The glue is doing a lot of work here. The thread is almost supplementary to the glue, but it's definitely, aesthetically you want to keep those threads nice and tight. You want it to look nice for a long time. You'll see on this side of the sheath as well, I did put that hole for the rivet, and the reason is, again, for that square knot that I'm going to tie at the end of this stitch run. I want to keep everything nice and tight, and the rivet that I put in there will make sure that everything stays in. Now, in between one of the heat treating sessions, I had the knife, so I was able to try that out and make sure it fit. And I'm just burnishing the other edge of the leather. And now the customer had specifically asked for a black sheath, so I'm using some black leather dye. And I'm going to apply 2 coats of this to get a really even and dark finish. But I'm just making sure I cover all the surfaces and so there's no light spots. Something that is nice about dyeing leather, even if you have your rivets installed, the leather dye won't ever stick to the metal rivets. It just wipes right off with a little bit of acetone, so I don't really have to be too crazy and cautious when I apply leather dye at this stage. Now I'm just adding a hole in the large side of the sheath so that I can add the snap, and the male side is going to go on the strap, the female side is going to go on the body of the sheath. Just making sure everything fits. And now at this point the knife is fully tempered. So I utilized that time while I was in the oven to make the sheath, and now I can clean up my grinds and finish up the blade. Now that's out of the oven, I'm just sort of cleaning everything up, making sure I have enough meat on my edge so that I can get a good finished sharpened edge on it. And I'm moving up from the 80 grit that I was using to do the rough grinding into a 120 grit J-Flex belt, which is a flexible back belt. And these give a really nice surface finish, and I'm just getting all my flats nice and parallel. I want to make sure everything looks well. And here I'm using a 1/4 inch carbide burr, and this is how I put my sharpening choil in. And I basically just push directly onto this, and it gives me a nice semicircle in there that acts as a nice even sharpening choil. So something new to my knife making process is some sandblasting. So I recently picked up this sandblasting cabinet, and I'm just washing this out with some ceramic media, and this gives a nice even look. And from here, it's going to go into acid, and it's going to be stonewashed. So this is some PCB etchant solution, and I'm just putting it in a little plastic bin, and I leave the knife in there for an hour. And now, while it's in there, to try and be time efficient, I'm going to work on the scales. So the scales have been rough cut, and now I need to finish the tops of the scales. By finishing the tops of the scales, it makes it so that I don't have to try and access them once they're glued on, because that's really difficult to do without damaging the blade. So I start with some 80 grit paper, and I start to round out and roll off the tops of the scales to make them a little smoother and more ergonomic. I move over to my slack belt attachment that I made, and I just kind of roll everything down, switch from an 80 to a 120, and I get everything nice and smooth. Now once I have it smoothed out on the belt sander, it's time to move over to some hand sanding to get a really nice slick finish. So this little custom vise stand that I made is great for holding things in weird positions, and I start with some 400 grit paper, and I work up to a 600 and 800 grit just to make sure that everything is really smooth to the touch. This ebony is very oily wood, and if you push it far enough you can really get like a glass smooth finish out of it, but it's definitely important to work through the grits on something like this. From the sandpaper, I go directly over to a buffing wheel with a white compound and a loose buff, and this gives me like a mirror polish. It looks a lot like buffalo horn, and I'm really happy with the way the ebony buffs out. Now at this point the knife's been in there for an hour, and I can go and rinse it off and then throw it in the rock tumbler. So I leave it wet and soapy, and I put it in the rock tumbler, and that sort of lubricates it a little bit. I'll leave it in here for about 45 minutes. I found I get the best results out of this tumbler with the lid off, so that the media can really jump around a lot. I'll pull the blade out and clean it off and show you what it looks like. I get a nice light gray stonewash out of it, and I'm really happy with the way it came out. At this point the scales can be glued on, and I'm going to use some G5 epoxy, which is by West System. It's a little faster drying than the traditional West System epoxy, but I've had really good luck with it, and I've used it on pretty much every knife that I've made. I make sure to coat the scales really well and make sure I get enough glue inside the holes for the pins so that nothing moves. And I'm conscious to get a good amount of clamps on there so I get some squeeze out, and I know that the glue is really contacting every surface well. I'm going to let this dry overnight. I also clean off any excess glue with acetone to make sure that nothing squeezes out and gets stuck on there, because man, it is a nightmare to get it off. Now the next day I'm in the shop and I pull off those clamps, and then I head over to the bandsaw to cut down the excess length that I left on those pins. You have to make sure to watch your heat when you are dealing with pins in a glued on handle, because if you heat those pins up too hot, they'll actually melt the epoxy, and then they'll move around on you a little bit. I used to try and grind my pins off, but I was actually heating them up so much that they would move, so now I cut them off with the bandsaw, and then I head back over to the belt grinder with another 80 grit belt, and I just flatten everything out. I'm taking pretty aggressive passes on the blade at this point because I want to remove a lot of that ebony material, get down to the metal of the handle, and I want to make sure that everything's nice and smoothed out and feels very flush. So I'm turning and rotating the blade a lot to get things even and get things rounded and contoured, and then I'll switch over from the flat platen and I'll move over into a small wheel. And you can see I'm finding a small wheel that fits perfectly inside my upper finger groove, and then I'm going to use that to profile that inner area. So I'll profile that area with 80 grit, and I'll get it down to the metal, and then I'll start to sort of rotate the knife so that I can give some contour to it and make it a little friendlier on the hand. And once that's done, I'll move up to a 120 grit J-flex again, and I'll smooth that out. Now everything on the handle is going to be hand sanded, so I can stop at the J-flex belt and move up from there and start doing some contouring with the slack belt. So here I'm just rounding everything out. I'm doing as much as I can with the machine because it saves a lot of time. And then once this is done, we'll start some hand sanding on the handle. I like to wrap my blade in paper just to make sure that I don't get any marks on it from the vise. Even though it's wood, sometimes it can leave some marks. And I do the same thing on the scales that I did on the upper part of the scales, where I start at a 400 and I work up to an 800, and I'm really just going for nice smooth contours. I really want the thing to feel comfortable in your hand. I don't want any sharp edges on it. Once I'm done sanding, I just take a little deburring tool and I deburr the inside of those pins because they had a little bit of a burr from grinding them down. I also noticed that the insides of the pins had some epoxy in them and they were a little dirty. So in an effort to shine them up, I took some sandpaper and a little wire brush and I cleaned them out with a drill. Now from that point, my handle finishing technique I've been doing is I've been soaking my handles in Danish oil for about an hour, and then I wipe off the excess and I bring it right over to the buffer and I get a really slick finish. Just cleaning off the excess and then hanging over to the buffer with a white compound on a loose buff, the same way I did the upper part. And I cleaned it out and add a little more compound so I know I have some fresh compound in there cutting. I also tape off the blade because I don't want to shine that blade at all. I want to just keep it matte and I want to keep it stonewashed. So I just try and mask it, and then you can see the way that handle polished up. It almost looks like a horn. You can see some grain pattern, but you also get that nice glossy look. Now the only last thing to do to the sheath is to add this little leather spot, and I put these inside all my sheaths that have a snap, and the purpose here is to keep that snap, the metal, from scratching up the blade or the handle. So I glue a little tiny coin of leather inside the sheath, and that just makes sure that that metal, you know, if it ever gets banged or dented, it never bends out and scratches the blade, because I don't want the blade to constantly be abused by the sheath. I had one little maker's mark on the sheath and it's all done, ready for a final edge. Now my sharpening technique, I've been doing this for a number of years, and I go from a 400 or a 600 grit silicone carbide to an 800 grit, then a 1000 grit, and then I move over to 2 leather strops, one which is loaded with a black compound, and then I move over to a strop with a green compound. And what this does is it essentially polishes the edge to a mirror polish, and it gives you a really refined edge that'll just shave the hair right off your arm. And I found this edge is pretty easy to maintain with regular sharpening, and it'll cut anything. Now at this point, the knife's 100% done. So let's get some glory shots of this thing. The black dye dyed the thread as well, which is really nice. Nice stealth look, and you can see the contrast between the glossy pins and the stonewashed blade. There's good engagement in the sheath, and it feels great in the hand. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions about knife making or any of the other things I did in this video, leave them in the comments. If you want a behind the scenes look at what goes on in the shop, follow us on Instagram at MakeEverythingShop. Again, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more content. And if you want any Make Everything merch, like a shirt or these new hats, check out our website, link below. Thanks again. See you on the next video.